Hello and welcome everyone to another live stream brought to you by ThoughtBot. Can we just all agree that music is banging?
Yes, amazing. I love the intro.
It's the best music I listen to all week.
Yeah. It kind of gets you into the vibe of yeah.
Proper, like it's a weird mix of emotions because it's like my adrenaline's going because I'm like nervous about the live stream, but then I'm also like just vibing to this music before we kick off.
Yeah, and it gets so much better towards the end when you're about to go live with all that nice animations.
Yeah, I think credit to Lindsay on the kind of marketing team at ThoughtBot for putting that together. So kind of a bit of a special stream, slightly connected to the AI in Focus series, where we're looking at different concepts in AI. This is born from me going down a rabbit hole last week during our investment times. At ThoughtBot, we have 1 day a week, which we dedicate to investment. And that allows us to go down rabbit holes and discover new things. I went down a rabbit hole looking at MCP, which is Model Context Protocol. So a lot of people are speaking about it. It bothered me that I didn't know what it was. I kind of thought, I think it was something bigger than it is. It sounded a lot bigger and broader and more impressive than it actually might be. So I messaged Jose, I messaged on ThoughtBot Slack, and I was like, does anyone want to chat about MCP and what I discovered? And people were like, yeah, let's chat about it. And that quickly spiraled into this live stream. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and hopefully it'll be a really helpful video. Let's start with LLMs, okay? And I really want this to be very much an organic conversation. So Rakesh and Jose, stop me, correct me. Like, I'm not an expert. I'm discovering this with you as we go along. Let's pull my screen up. So the best starting point I found, and this foundation, I watched a video on YouTube done by someone called Ross Mike last week, which was really helpful. Let me pull this up here. So this is an LLM, okay? So once upon a time, when everything was simple, we just had LLMs that you would send a prompt to, and it would respond with text. So imagine when we first found out ChatGPT, and we were kind of asking it, can you make me a poem? Or can you create a recipe for me? And it was good, but LLMs were kind of, they weren't that functional. They couldn't do that much. They were very impressive word predictors, but they weren't as good as they are now. And one of the reasons they're really good now is because we added what we call tools, or what we can think of APIs that LLMs can reach out to. Because an LLM in and of itself is just a word predictor. So
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of what would be a good example. But let's say originally, right, you would ask. So let me pull this here. So you would have that, and then pull that there, and pull that there. Bring that down center. Oh, no, not do that. Like this. Here we go. Okay, so let's call this a tool. Let's call this a tool. And we'll call that one, you guessed it, a tool. Right. So you would ask an LLM, let's think of a prompt. Any suggestions? What prompt? Think of any prompt.
Mm. I don't know. To suggest recipes for the week,
Okay,
like
cool.
food
Suggest me
recipes.
recipes for the week. Yeah. So without tools, the LLM only has the knowledge that it's been trained on, right? With a tool, so a tool might be, for example, so you've given a prompt to the LLM and you've said, just put it here.
And I
Oh,
see.
now I'm going to have to spell recipes live. Recipes. Oh, come on.
Yes.
Do you even know how?
Like
It's
without the
PES.
I.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So without the tools, the LLM receives this prompt, and all it can do is based on what it already has. And we understand that the tools allows the LLM to say, I'll get into in more detail what I mean by who makes the call to the tools, but the LLM knows it's got access to certain tools. It can then go and ask and say, so imagine this is a tool to browse the internet, right? So it can browse the internet, right? And then it might also have access to a tool for counting calories, for example. So this might be a counting calorie tool.
Mhm.
Right. So the LLM can then decide which tools to reach out to. So
In my head, when you said tools, I thought there will be a kitchen tool in which it will automatically prepare me my recipe.
that'd be amazing. Right. Let's
We will get to
clarify
that
that.
point, Rakesh, I think.
Yeah, it's gonna
Is that
happen. So
like
let's
the
clarify.
AGI moment for
Oh,
AI?
yes.
Yeah, let's think of these because in a programmatic sense, they're just APIs. I think in the LLM, like when you're using the syntax that LLMs like to use, I think they use the word tool. But I'm not sure why that is. So we need to so this is the way that LLMs have got really, really powerful. And the way they've done this is by calling all these tools. So this is something called function calling, which came in a while back. And I think to understand model context protocol, it's going to help to dive a little bit deeper into actually how this works, right? So let's leave that up there for the moment and let's do it in the context of a Rails app. I know it's not really relevant, but it kind of is helpful. So imagine you've got a Rails front end. So this is a Rails front end. And on that Rails front end, you've got some sort of a form with an input where you can ask an LLM to do something. Let's use a clearer example. So let's say, book me flights. Okay.
Mhm.
You're asking LLM to book me flights. Maybe you give dates. That doesn't really matter at the moment. Where that then goes is, I'm going to drop this down a bit further. We can ignore the one above. We can come back to it. That then goes to a controller, right? Now, let's pretend you've got you're integrated with OpenAI just because it's an easy one
Mhm.
to start with. So this is OpenAI LLM, and there's loads of gems which can help you very easily integrate with OpenAI. So that prompt comes through to your controller. You take that prompt and you hand it over to the LLM. Now, if you hand that over to the LLM, just plain, go on, Jose. You coming in, Jose? No, okay, fine. If you hand that prompt straight over to the LLM will say, "That's lovely. You want to book flights. I don't know how to do that." So this is where function calling comes in. So you say to the LLM, you say, "Here is a prompt," and you say, "It's book me flights," and then you say, "And here is a tool you can use," right? And you tell it you've got access to a Skyscanner tool, right? A tool which allows you to find out how to book flights. So the LLM now responds to you and it comes back to you and it says, let's pull that down there. It says, I would like to use let's say we say the tool is, let's just call it, you've got access to a method called search flights, which in the background will go to Skyscanner. We'll look at that in a sec. So it says, I would like to use the search flights tool, because you've described it and you've said you have a tool called search flights and it will allow you to work out what flights someone might need to book flights. So it understands I need to use search flights. Once that's come back to your controller, right, your controller then is the thing that goes and calls that function. So let's put this is the Skyscanner API here. Okay, so now the controller says, based on the LLM's response, I go and make the call to Skyscanner, and then Skyscanner responds to the controller. And let's just think about this. So from the controller, this is where you have to, there's some logic that needs to happen in the controller. So the controller, when the LLM says use the search flights API, the LLM, this is actually important, I forgot this, tells you to do that with JSON. Okay?
So, Sami, if I understand this correctly, we send a prompt to OpenAI to book a flight, and
Yep.
we also expose this tool called search flights that the LLM can use to call
Yep.
your code back, which is your Rails controller. And your controller in turn will use that tool and be able to access the Skyscanner API. It's kind of like a three-way communication, but the LLM is the one that's initiating all the communication to the Rails controller, right? Is my
Yes,
understanding correct?
that's correct. Just one thing we have to, like, the LLM is very, very stupid. Okay, so it doesn't know how to make the calls. So like you're saying, so the LLM sends, this is where JSON's important. I'm trying to see how I can color this. Give me, because this is where this will be important later on.
You have font
Style.
color there. If you go to text, I think, Sammy.
Oh, text.
You have font color. Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to give it like the box. Oh, I see, but I maybe can't do that. I thought it was a box. No, it's not. Okay, it's fine. We'll leave it at that. But that JSON is important. Actually, I do know how to do it. If I take that away, bring that in.
Nice.
And I say JSON like this, and just make it a bit small. Jose, what color do you like?
The orange one.
The orange one. We'll go for it. Make two of these. Okay.
Sorry, I had some issues with my audio before.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, yeah. So Rakesh, as you were saying, so you basically say that the LLM or OpenAI's LLM requires you, they will have documentation, and that documentation will say, how can you let me know about the tools you have available? Right? And then the OpenAI LLM will have documentation which will say, and this is the JSON that I give you back to tell you to call the search flights. So at this point, for our controller to work, it has to know what JSON to send to the LLM to let it know what tools it has. And it also has to know like what the LLM, what JSON the LLM will use to tell you whether to make the call. Does that part make sense? So our controller has to know how we structure the JSON that we send to the LLM to let it know what tools it has.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, and then when the LLM responds, right? OpenAI have hard coded or whatever they've done on the LLM. They've told it you respond with certain structured JSON to say go and make this call to search flights. And so the developer who's working on this controller has to know how to let the LLM know about tools it can use and what to do when and what sort of JSON is going to come back that it can then go and make that call. Okay, so our controller then takes the JSON, right? And it has to make an API request. So it has to turn that JSON that it's got from the LLM into an API request that it can send to Skyscanner. And it hits the search flights method. Is that what we were calling it? Yeah, it hits the search flights method that exists in Skyscanner. And Skyscanner responds with, API response. So let me just put this. So JSON goes for an API request. And then you get this API response. And okay, let me ask you like this. So when the controller gets an API response, do you know what it does next with the API response? Can you think what it does?
When you receive it, you mean?
Yeah, so the controller sent out a request to Skyscanner saying search flights because the LLM said I want to use that tool. Skyscanner has now responded with a number of flights that it could use. What do you think the controller does next?
Send it back to the LLM for further processing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now the controller says, so I need to differentiate these lines. So these lines are going to be blue because they are kind of the first part of the conversation. And we'll make these lines red, just as the second part of the conversation. So now the controller says to the LLM, here is the response from Skyscanner. And I'm not sure I'm not sure how it gives that response exactly, but it gives a response back to Skyscanner. And then the LLM responds back to the controller and actually has a message for the end user, right? We made it book flights. Let's just make it simple because it might have to use another tool to do that. Let's just call it find me flights. It doesn't have to do the booking, but the principle's the same. So let's just go over it again. We've had someone came to your application. They typed in find me flights. The controller sends this prompt to the LLM together with tools that the LLM can use, an API that the LLM can use to search for flights. The way it does this is it uses JSON. Okay. The LLM responds also with JSON to say, yep, I want to use this tool. The controller then has to take that JSON, and this is where Model Context Protocol will come in and make things easier. First, understanding how it currently works. So before Model Context Protocol, the controller takes that JSON, converts it into the correct API request for Skyscanner, and then Skyscanner responds with its regular API response, and the controller probably, I think, has to again put it back into JSON in order to give the response appropriately back to LLM. I'm not sure about this step. I can't remember. And then eventually a message comes back for the end user, which then the controller delivers back to the front end and says, here are your flights. Okay. At the moment, even without Model Context Protocol, this is not so bad, right? But now what would happen if we added either a new endpoint from Skyscanner, which we wanted to integrate with, or a different tool. Let's say now we want a booking tool. So we've got a booking.com tool API endpoint, which says book flights. Yeah. So either we do that, or we say, well, we're using OpenAI for one thing because it's really good at searching flights, but actually I want to use Claude or Gemini, whatever it is, to do something else. So every time we add a new component, our controller needs to know a lot of things. It needs to know exactly what structure the JSON needs to be to send to the LLM, exactly what JSON structure it takes back, and then it needs to know how to convert that JSON into API requests, which will be different depending on the actual tool, and then it hands those back to the LLM. So there's a lot of information and a lot of differences between like either different AI models or different tools that you're using. Is that so far clear? It doesn't have to be clear. If it's confusing and you're not sure about things, let me know.
No, it's
It looks
quite
clear to me. I guess also you need to know what tools do you have in each of the, like what tools each of the LLMs can handle, basically.
Yeah.
When you send the JSON
Yeah.
and then
yeah, go on.
sorry, no, I was thinking like also I guess MCPs or model context protocol, what it helps is to then standardize all the interactions we are doing, right? Like is making easier the way we interact with each of the LLMs because it's standardized thanks to these MCPs.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So this is where yeah, it makes sense to start to talk about model context protocol now. So the model context protocol is an agreement initially the agreement is between actually AI models. So companies like OpenAI, companies like Claude, Gemini, whatever the companies are that are producing these models. And what they agreed on, they said, and what I'm going to do is going to copy and paste this so we can refer to this later. Let's call this one, let's call this function calling without MCP. And then we'll copy and paste all of this. Okay, so this is function calling with MCP. So what they said is, let's all agree to use the same JSON structure for how we expect to receive information about what tools we can use, and also how we say we would like to use those tools. So it's this JSON here which becomes really, really important. This JSON here is the MCP protocol.
So are you telling me that if we do, let's say, an implementation with OpenAI, and at some point it's decided that you want to move on to other model, thanks to MCP, the only thing I need to do is just changing the model?
Yeah. If they agree to the MCP protocol, then you will be using the controller will use the same JSON structure, whether it's talking to OpenAI or someone else, and send that JSON structure across, and it will also receive the same JSON structure back.
Okay.
Okay. So the first part of MCP is to say, when we do function calling, we will standardize our JSON to how we understand what tools we have and how we tell the controller, whatever it's going to, we tell the receiver how to call that how to call that tool.
So in our example, the two different tools that we have in the project is one is search flights and the other is book flights. So we kind of attach details about how you can call those two tools as part of that JSON, so that LLMs have as much information as it needs to access those tools. Is that correct?
At what point are you saying? At this point here?
Yeah, that point in the JSON that we send.
At this point, we have a standardized JSON that we send along, and that JSON, it's like got tools, parameters, description, and enough that the LLM can understand whether all the LLM has to do is make a decision whether to make the call. That's all it's doing.
Yeah.
So if it makes a decision to make the call, it comes back to us and it says, here is my response to you using structured JSON that says make the call with these parameters, and that's probably all it can give. So that's so the first part of MCP is the LLMs, or the company that built these LLMs, they came together and said, we will conform to JSON structure for function calling. The second part, which makes this even more powerful, is they then said to providers like Skyscanner API and Skyscanner and let's say Booking.com, you need to create separate endpoints. Some call it separate servers, like MCP servers. They don't have to be separate servers, right? I want you to create separate endpoints called, let's just make it simple for now, MCP/search_flights. And then they would make one here called, so just a different endpoint, MCP/book_flights. So the operators of LLMs said, if you want our LLMs to integrate with your tools, set up your endpoints so they can understand our structured JSON. Because now that we have JSON, which everyone agrees to is a certain standard, right, which the LLM gives us to say, this is how I want to call your tool, these APIs know what to expect. So here the controller says something very simple. Send the JSON to the endpoint. That's all it says. Beforehand, the controller was saying, right, you're giving me this JSON. Let me look at the documentation of the Skyscanner API and work out how to convert that JSON into an API request. Now the onus is on the API endpoints, right? The companies who are providing these API endpoints to set up their APIs so they can receive LLM JSON. So this is just JSON gets sent across. And they also have to respond with JSON. What JSON? They use the same structured JSON that the LLM understands. And then the controller, and we can go over this in a sec, I know it's a lot of information at one time. The controller then says, send the JSON response back to the LLM. So what you've done is the controller was kind of a proxy. It sat between your LLM and it sat between your endpoints, and it had to do a lot of logic to change JSON back into turn it into API requests, and then turn API responses back into JSON. And it had to know so much. It had to, for different endpoints, it would have to know logic about every single different endpoint. And for different LLMs, it would have to know logic about different JSON. This is MCP. MCP standardizes this JSON, and it allows you, as long as people conform to it, which means the LLMs have to conform and people who build endpoints have to conform, it's going to make things a lot easier for us as developers to say, here is JSON, you give it back to me, I throw it to that endpoint, it knows how to handle it, and I throw it back. And it kind of moves all that logic closer to the people who create the endpoints.
That is so cool.
It's cool, right? Once you understand it and you go through it, I think it's so cool.
I have a question. So in this case, the MCP or the Model Context Protocol was actually implemented by Skyscanner API and not our Rails controller, right? Our Rails controller is just like you said, being a proxy and throwing JSON back and again getting the incoming JSON and throwing it back to the OpenAI LLM and so on. So it's just being like a middleman kind of middle person kind of role here.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. And so what they've done, and so this is where when people say, "Can you create an MCP server or can you create an MCP protocol?" So let's imagine the Thoughtbot blog, right? At the moment, let's pretend I don't think we have one, but let's pretend we have an API endpoint that allows you to search for blogs, and that expects an API request, which is a normal API request, and it's got its own type of body that it wants when you make the request. It's a GET request, but it's got its own type of syntax for that request. What we would do if we want to make things easier for LLMs to hit our blog endpoint and understand what blogs we have available, we would create either people call it a separate MCP server, but I think that's overkill. We just create a separate endpoint. We namespace an endpoint and we say, /MCP blog endpoint. And then we can tell LLMs and say, you can use this function. You've got this function now of kind of go and query the blog, and the blog is set up using the MCP protocol. So that we have, as API providers, we need to change our APIs if it's worth it and valuable to be able to take in the MCP JSON, do whatever logic it needs to do to pull the blog posts, and give back the JSON that the LLM understands.
That's so good.
It's so good. Go on.
Sami,
Hit me.
I'll go next if you wanted to speak about something.
No.
Okay. So in this case, it feels more like the search flights API from Skyscanner that is used by the LLMs. How do you do things like rate limiting and kind of anybody can start hitting these endpoints and kind of get free information, right? So what's a way in which they would try to limit you so that you only use it? I don't know. This is a question that comes to mind.
So your question is, if people are using LLMs a lot and they're hitting them with prompts, then you're saying the LLM will hit the API multiple times or too many times?
It will hit the API and you can basically obtain all the information. Uh, let's say the flight information about what flights are running today or running in the future along with their price. The data about all these things is like there is a cost associated with it. You don't want this kind of information to be freely available, right? So typically
Okay.
if you want to use their traditional APIs, there would be like a paid plan or something in which you get like a limited number of requests for the cost you pay and all those things. But with this, since you're exposing this kind of a thing to an LLM, somebody could just use an LLM and start making so many requests and kind of get free data from the API provider, right? So do you have you thought about this or?
Yeah, I mean, remember the LLM can't do anything. It can't make the calls. So the LLM is not making the calls. All the LLM does is goes back to the controller and it says, "Can you make this call for me?" So then the controller, which makes the call and sends that JSON across, will still have to have an API key that submits to a certain plan, which can be rate limited. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So, so the LLM is not making the call, but
Yeah,
rather our
yeah.
controller is making the call and handing the JSON back.
Yeah, I spent so long, like last week, and I was talking to ChatGPT about it as well. I was convinced LLMs were able to make were able to make the calls themselves. That's what I initially thought Model Context Protocol is, but it's not at all. The LLMs are just still word predicting machines,
Right.
and they can't do that at all. It's the controller which then makes the decision.
That makes a lot of sense. In that case, they'd probably not allow unlimited requests unless you have the appropriate keys and so
Yeah.
on.
That's a really good question. I didn't think about that actually. But yeah, your controller is there in the middle, and then you control everything basically, as usual. You need to have the key to get the information.
Yeah. But what I really wanted to get across with this is not a big deal. This is not a massive change. We've already been doing function calling. So we already seen, we showed above here how function calling, we've been doing this already. And all we're doing is making life easier for the controller. That's basically all we're doing. We're making life easier for the thing that sits between the LLMs and those external APIs. And saying, instead of you having to know how each LLM needs to receive its response and makes requests, and how each API makes its response and requests, let's standardize both of those. So it's these components here which are agreeing to a certain protocol. And that protocol is called Model Context Protocol. And they agree, and they just make integrations easier. That's all they do. You could ignore model context. You could build everything without MCP. If you never use MCP, you could build exactly the same functionality. It's just this will make it easier. And with that, I think we're pretty much at time. Is there any follow-up questions you have or thoughts?
A last question. I know we are at time. Let's say booking.com or one of the providers has not implemented the model context protocol, then we have no other way other than using the regular way of send a request, get the response back, and parse it and send it in the format in which the LLM would accept, right?
Correct. 100% correct. Exactly. So the success of this protocol is based on people taking it up and implementing it. If I don't know what the statistics are because it's relatively new, but if people decide it's not good and I'm not going to stick to that standard, then it's not going to help anybody. It's only if people all adhere to the standards and say, yes, we will implement it. And another thing I forgot to mention, which is also why it's easier, if booking.com or Skyscanner would make a change in their API, so they would change, let's say, a parameter that they send back, or they just change something, we wouldn't necessarily have to change our controller because they're conforming to the same JSON. So let's say whatever their response is, they send back the responses they would previously. So in the previous iteration, if something changes with a third-party API, everything breaks. This way, the providers like Skyscanner, Booking.com can make changes without necessarily breaking things because they still conform to the JSON. So
That
that's
is
also
helpful.
like another added benefit.
That's really
Yeah, but that's it in a nutshell. One last recommendation is go and check out an AI in Focus talk that Chad did with the creator of Active Agent. So Active Agent is a gem which sits in that controller space that we've been talking about, and it just makes it really easy to make these calls out to LLMs and kind of third-party tools. So that's just a small plug for that gem. That's something which I came across and probably need to look into a bit more. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and
thank you, Sammy.
I appreciate you getting me to just get this done, to do this stream.
Thanks, Sammy. I learned so much. This was very useful.
Yes, thank you so much.
Cool. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.